In this video, we're going to talk about all things security assessment methods. And the methods are built on conversation from our previous video that we discussed. I'm going to write assessments here, just so people don't think it means something else. This is just another video that sort of adds on to the videos that we mentioned before about different types of security assessments. There's obviously different functions and different levels of testing that we can undergo through each of those areas. And in this video, we're going to cover exactly what they all are. So I'm just going to get my pen ready. And this is in no order. We don't have to do one or the other, and there's no sort of tier approach or anything like that. This is just some of the different sort of styles of testing and the different types of methods across our testing methodologies. So the first part that we've got down here is our static and our dynamic bits of testing. And this is traditionally, if we talk about static, I'm just going to do static over here, and then I'll do dynamic on the other side. And then static is basically static analysis. Now, if we're going to do maybe a pen test, or maybe we're going to go away and actually do, a code analysis across the infrastructure, well, chances are there's difference between the two, right? So we've got a static analysis of the code, which traditionally means it's very time consuming, right? So you've got to statically analyze that information. You've got to go through those lines of code and then go through each bit of that and understand, well, how's this application functioning? And then you're looking for security risks, or you're defining network traffic through, maybe you're using Wireshark, and you've got to go through Wireshark at some stage. And then, well, what's that DHCP traffic? And, is anything that's malicious going on with DNS? And is anything happening with ARP? And the list goes on right through network protocols. So if you're doing static analysis, chances are it's an individual, or it's someone, a multiple amounts of people or a different team of people, and they're typically doing that static analysis across networks, infrastructure, applications. And the worst thing about this, it's prone to errors, right? Sometimes we can make a mistake. Something does get overseen or didn't get seen. So it is quite hard and challenging to sit there all day and look at maybe firewall traffic, or maybe look at information from source IP address, destination IP address. Is anything happening malicious? Maybe destination ports, protocols, the 5 tuples, because you're going to sit there and you're going to have to filter and statically analyze the firewall traffic, right? And there's so much information that's going through that thing, which can sometimes be very overwhelming, and it's not for me. And hats off to the people that sit there and look at firewall traffic logs every single day. So that's static analysis. And the next one here is dynamic. And dynamic, if you've already kind of understood what dynamic means, it's the automation of that process. So typically it's automated, and we're using some sort of scanners or tool sets to analyze and define, those vulnerabilities. My V's and U's look very identical, which I do not like. My vulns and risks, and obviously our weaknesses, right? So when we have our dynamic tools, there's obviously a set of automation that takes place that can automate part of that process, and maybe we just come in for a manual piece that we're going to then investigate. So that's kind of the difference between static testing and dynamic testing. Another one here is our side channel analysis. And side channel analysis, if I just finish writing that up, side channel analysis just basically says one thing, right? It's, are there any leakages, right? Any leaks coming from that server, any leaks coming from that host? Chances are sometimes when we could send, maybe we're sending a HTTP GET request to a web server, and then that web server then responds back with the information that we've requested, but then it's also going, well, do you also want our, and it's more of a gratuitous ARP, right? It's sort of shoving that information in our face. And I'm not going to talk about gratuitous ARP because we're not on the subject of forcing ARP traffic and becoming that sort of man in the middle. But think about, sometimes where a web server or a server in Change, you're sort of asking it for one thing and it gives you what you want, but then it also says, well, here's my private IP address. Well, isn't that great? Well, here's, maybe my MAC address, and maybe here is maybe my service version. well, we're not really asking for that sensitive information, right? Now, should that information come back, that is a security risk, right? And we've seen, many times, in pen testing and other sort of assurance stuff that we've done, a lot of servers do this, right? They may give you your IP address and they will give you a service version of that protocol that it's running, right? Maybe it's going to say, well, I'm running on Apache 2.2.2 or whatever we're running on, right? That is a risk, right? So chances are with side channel analysis, we don't want it giving us that information, right? So that's sometimes a security risk. It's problematic. And that is obviously a risk to the business. So we need to be mindful when we're doing side channel analysis that we are defining, are there any leaks across the business? And if so, what are those leaks? And obviously being mindful of what they are. The other part here is reversing, right? And I'm talking about reverse engineering. And typically when we're doing reverse engineering, we're kind of going through an application or a software of some sort. And we're kind of seeing a way that it operates and functions and the way it's doing something. So you got to have a very specific knack for that application or that very specific software. It could be an Android function or an Android application. It could be iOS application, depending on what function or what bit of testing you're doing. Maybe it's a mobile app, right? Talking about Android and iOS. And when we reverse it, we want to take or we want to abuse some sort of service or some sort of information against it. So kind of looping in side channeling if it's giving us more information, but we need to understand first how it works. So when we're reverse engineering it, we're then seeing if there's ways that we can bypass certain controls, right? And that's all the point of reverse engineering. So we want to bypass certain controls or certain flaws in that application or in that mobile, the way it's been sort of coded, or to do something with a certain function or a feature. The other area here that I want to touch on as we continue up this ladder is our wireless assessments. And wireless assessments, when we are testing wireless, and I'm running out of room here. So what I may do is I'm just going to, let's get rid of this, just to free up a little bit of real estate here. Okay. So traditionally, anytime we do wireless assessments, we're basically testing the access points, right? Or we're testing the APs across the business's environment, right? So we're typically looking out, or we're sort of going through, wireless. Well, what does wireless traffic do? So what does an AP do us? Well, firstly, the first thing that I can think of that it gives us is, well, it's sending out wireless signals, right? So it's giving us the mobility to move around without being tied to a desk through obviously an Ethernet connection, right? So typically when we're doing wireless assessments, we're kind of testing for a couple of things. Now I'll just do a couple of points here. And the first thing that we're kind of testing is, we're doing testing of, is their encryption, right? Are they using the right encryption tools? Can it be broken? Can we intercept that WP, the WPA handshake? Can we then go away and then crack it with an offline table for some sort, right? And is that going to be an issue? Because then if we've cracked their encryption and we've got their key, can we then come back later with our own laptop and then connect up to the wireless? And then can we connect and obviously do whatever we want to do with our infrastructure? So first part is our encryption that we kind of look at. Obviously, the encryption algorithms, we want to define what they are. I'm just going to say algos for short. And then obviously the other part there is to misconfigs, right? If someone has misconfigured something, we want to know about it. And traditionally, this kind of moves over into, I guess, rogue APs sometimes, because maybe there's a rogue AP that's kind of looking like the organization's AP, and it's got a better signal. So it's a stronger signal. And then people from the business will then connect into that AP because it's got a better signal. They'll deal with all the clients off this one, and then it'll force them to reconnect to your rogue AP. And this is not a good thing, right? I've done a lot of wireless assessments, and the first thing that we kind of scope out is doing rogue devices, because we want to then force clients to deauthenticate. And there's obviously controls that we can then put in place that we can prevent against that. So when we want to test this out, we want to make sure that as the devices deauthenticate, are they then connecting to the right device? And if so, how do we ensure that they are going to connect into the authentic and the correct device? So chances are when we're doing rogue attacks, if we're performing that man in the middle here, then we're going to do things like SSL stripping, And then, we can then see all that traffic as it goes through to the internet. So you're essentially becoming that man in the middle. Again, very disruptive. Obviously, amazing ways to do this, but rogue APs is obviously something that we want to test for and look out for as well. All right, moving on. So we've done our wireless assessments. What else do we have? We've got fuzzing. So you may hear fuzzing when we're doing web application functions. And basically fuzzing just says, if you're familiar with Nmap, I just kind of think of this as a TAC-A command. And TAC-A, we want to define everything. It's throwing the whole kitchen sink at it, right? And this kind of looks at, if we've got a web page over here, and then within that web page, maybe there's a sign-in form there that we've got, maybe the username and password. Well, if we're going to be doing fuzzing, and then we've got a little submit button here, and then we're going to throw everything at this login form, we're going to throw in bash, and we're going to throw in Python, and then we're going to throw in whatever SQL injection attacks, and we're going to throw everything we can possibly think of. Well, and then we hit submit. Well, there's a few things that are going to happen. One is we want to see if there's error checking done correctly. Obviously, data sanitization, that not everything can be sent into that, the little username field there. But we want to make sure that we can't bypass any controls or authentication mechanisms. And if we can do all these attacks, well, then potentially that's an issue and that's a risk within the organization. So sometimes fuzzing has to be done on a very lightweight approach. And I kind of say lightweight because if you start doing this, and then all you're going to get in the back end are like 1,000 alerts that are going to come through, right? And then chances are those alerts are going to a person, and they are not going. I'm going to put an angry face there, because all those alerts are going to go back to that single person or persons or people. So you just need to be really mindful when you're doing fuzzing or any aggressive fuzzing, that one, you have that in scope that you are going to be doing fuzzing, the alerting, how that's all going to happen in the back end, and making sure those the click and the submit functions are properly sanitized as well. When we talk about data sanitization, obviously the input fields and all that sort of stuff is done correctly, and it is sanitizing the data correctly, which is the main point of fuzzing. But just be mindful that if you're going to go away and do this without the consent of the customer, it's going to cause a bit of issues. And lastly, as we sort of get to the final point at the top here, as I said before, this is not a tiered approach or anything like that. Not one is better than the other. This is just an easy way to sort of define them. I've got dependency management here, because anytime we do pen testing or anytime we do vulnerability assessments, there's always a dependency, whether it's Java, whether it's Python, whether it's maybe Apache or something like that. There's a dependency with that language or with that process, right? And sometimes when we talk about applications, these things have dependencies to operate. And if we need to run Python, well, we have to install Python, and then it's got its dependencies that it may require to run a certain function. So we've got to go away and have that we've got to have that dependency management on how we're going to manage all our dependencies and our software versions and stuff like that, because those versions is what's going to cause some issues sometimes with web pages or with applications, because if we don't manage them correctly, we need to look at that main version as well. And sometimes there may be risks or vulnerabilities that we need to define and obviously have documented through the environment. So that kind of sums up our final video here across our methods and types of methods through security assessments. I hope you found this video useful. And as always, I'll see you guys all in the next video.